I always thought of my dad as a solid man, someone who had my back when it counted. He was a bit old-fashioned, sure. He believed in hard work, in delayed gratification, in saving for what you wanted. He wasn't one for grand gestures or emotional speeches, but he had this quiet way of showing love. At least, that's what I always told myself. I'd never put it into words, but there was always something that didn't sit right with me, something in the way he never really let me fully stand on my own. We'd been through a lot together, just the two of us. My mom died when I was a kid, and after that, Dad was all I had. He did his best, even if his best sometimes felt more like a silent expectation. I learned early on that love wasn't so much about affection as it was about doing what was right. For him, that meant teaching me the value of money, something he believed was key to surviving the world. I'd been around money my whole life. Dad had his own business, a small but successful contracting company. He always had work, always had cash in hand, but he wasn't the flashy type. You won't find any luxury cars in our driveway. Instead, there were years of saving, years of watching his pennies. So when I turned 18 and he opened that joint savings account in my name, I thought it was just another one of those life lessons. It was his idea, of course. "This will teach you how to save," he'd said, sitting me down at the kitchen table like I was a little kid again. The way he said it, like he was passing on some sort of sacred knowledge, made me feel important, like this account was my ticket to adulthood. We set a modest goal, and he always made sure to point out how proud he was of me whenever I added to it. It wasn't a huge amount of money, but over the years, it grew. I'd been adding what I could to it from part-time jobs and later from the freelance work I did during college. I didn't spend much. Sure, I had the occasional splurge a nice pair of boots or a dinner out with friends, but my dad had drilled into me the importance of saving for the future. There was always something that felt so solid and dependable about that account. It was there for emergencies, for a rainy day, for when I was ready to take a leap, maybe even buy a house someday. But now, that security was starting to feel more like a cage. Dad had remarried a few years ago. I'd been skeptical about it from the start. It wasn't that I hated his new wife, Karen. In fact, she was perfectly nice at least when she wasn't pretending to care about things she didn't understand. The way she'd come into his life so quickly after Mom died, it just rubbed me the wrong way. I know it sounds petty, but it felt like she was trying to take my place in a way. Dad seemed completely enchanted by her, though. They did everything together, went on little weekend trips, posted photos of their perfect life on social media. I had tried to adjust. I went to their wedding, I smiled, I congratulated them. But something always felt off, like I was being squeezed out of a life that was supposed to be mine too, but I never expected him to do this. It started with small things at first. He'd ask me to help him with his finances, usually to explain a few numbers on a spreadsheet or look over some bills. But it always felt more like an excuse for him to get me involved. He'd say it was for my benefit, teaching me how to manage my own finances. The truth? He was getting me to do the heavy lifting while he coasted through life, hiding behind his businessman persona. I didn't mind helping, of course, until it became clear that the one person I had always relied on to help me make decisions was the same person who was undermining my ability to make them at all. He never seemed to trust me with anything of real importance. Not my career decisions, not my personal life, and certainly not my finances. It was this nagging sense that no matter how much I did, I was never fully trusted to stand on my own 2 feet. And honestly, I thought it was just part of life. After all, his way had worked for him, right? What I didn't realize was that my dad had been quietly preparing for something entirely different. The first time I noticed something was off was a few weeks ago when I logged into my bank account to check on my savings. I had been looking at possible apartment listings, wondering if it was time to move out of the place I'd been renting. I clicked on the account, and there it was. My balance was almost zero. At first, I thought I had made a mistake. I double-checked everything, reloaded the page, and checked the transaction history. Sure enough, every cent had been withdrawn. At first, I thought it was a mistake, but as I kept scrolling, I saw the charges. Some of them were from high-end resorts, expensive restaurants, and boutique shopping trips, all for someone named Karen. My hands went cold. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity. It wasn't just a little money, it was everything. Every dollar I'd saved for the last 5 years, all gone. I sat there for a moment, paralyzed by a rush of emotions. The betrayal hit harder than I expected. Dad had always taught me to save, to be careful with my money, to be responsible. He had opened this account for me so I would learn, and now he'd emptied it to pay for his second honeymoon. I couldn't believe it. I just sat there, staring at the screen, my mind spinning. My first reaction was to check the date. Maybe it was a mistake, or maybe it was some kind of fraudulent charge. There was no way this could be happening. No way my father could have taken every penny I'd worked so hard for without telling me, without a single word. I scrolled through the transactions again, the disbelief turning to something colder. The amount of money drained from my account wasn't just a few $100s or even 1,000. It was everything. Every single cent that had been building up over the years, gone. The charges were so excessive I had to blink several times just to process them. Expensive resort stays, fine dining at 5-star restaurants, and boutique shopping trips in exotic locations. There was even a charge for a luxury spa in Bali. I clicked on the last transaction, the one that finally broke me. A booking confirmation for a honeymoon suite at a high-end resort in the Caribbean. The dates lined up with the trip Dad and Karen had taken just 2 weeks ago. This was no accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. My father, the man who had opened this account with me to teach me how to save, had taken everything to fund a honeymoon for him and his new wife. I felt a pit form in my stomach. The betrayal cut deeper than I expected. How could he do this to me? My heart was pounding. I tried to calm down, but my thoughts were racing faster than I could catch them. He always talked about family first, about how money should be shared and kept in the family, especially in tough times. He'd even made a show of opening this account with me, teaching me about budgeting, about saving for things that mattered. And now, it was all gone spent on his second honeymoon. I quickly logged out of my bank account, like somehow that would make the situation less real. But I knew it wouldn't. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number for the bank, my fingers trembling as I pressed the screen. The call felt like it took forever to go through, but I finally got a customer service representative. My words were quick, rushed. "There's been a mistake with my account. All of the money, everything has been withdrawn. Can you tell me what happened?" There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear the sound of typing before she spoke again, her voice sympathetic. "I'm sorry to hear that, ma'am. I'm showing you have no pending charges, but I do see that the funds were withdrawn in full. The last transaction appears to be from 2 weeks ago for a large resort booking." My breath hitched. Yeah, that was my dad. I could feel my blood starting to boil, the heat creeping up my neck. He took the money, all of it, to fund a trip with his wife. The woman seemed to falter, as if unsure how to respond. "I'm sorry, ma'am. It appears there's no fraud involved, as the transaction was initiated by you, through your father." My father. The words stung more than I wanted them to. The idea of him, my dad, doing this to me, without a second thought, without even a shred of consideration, made my stomach churn. He hadn't even told me, not a single word. I hung up abruptly, trying to steady my breathing, but the shaking wouldn't stop. The anger was bubbling up inside me, but I didn't know where to direct it. Was I angry at my dad? At Karen? Or at myself for trusting him, for thinking he had my back like he always claimed? I had to act fast. I couldn't let this slide. Not this time. I grabbed my laptop again, eyes bloodshot from staring at the screen too long, and logged into my account. I didn't care what it took. If he was going to pull something like this, then I was going to make sure he faced the consequences. I clicked on the freeze account option. My hands shook as I typed in my password. I'd never felt more desperate to protect what was mine, and I couldn't afford to wait around and hope that my dad would somehow make it right. I had worked too hard for this money, put too much trust into this account, to let him just drain it for some extravagant honeymoon. Once the account was frozen, I felt a brief moment of relief, if only for a second. But I knew that wouldn't be enough. I needed to reverse the charges, every single one of them. I wasn't just going to let him get away with this. I had a plan, but first I needed to confront him. But how could I even start that conversation? How could I face him after this? I already knew he'd try to deny it or make excuses. I was sure he'd say he didn't mean to or that it wasn't that big of a deal. I couldn't even imagine how he'd react when I told him what I'd done, what I was about to do. The thought of his face when he realized I had frozen the account, the one thing he'd opened to teach me how to save, suddenly seemed more satisfying than anything. Maybe that was petty. Maybe it wasn't the most mature thing to do. But I was done being treated like a child in this relationship. It was time for him to feel the weight of his actions. And when I told him, I wanted him to know exactly how much he'd embarrassed me. The next few days felt like a slow, suffocating buildup. Every time I looked at my phone or my bank account, a new wave of anger washed over me. The situation felt like it had been brewing for years, but it wasn't until now, until this blatant act of betrayal, that it finally broke. I had been walking on eggshells around my father for so long, hoping for his approval, waiting for him to recognize me as an adult, and now it felt like everything I had worked for, everything I had trusted, had been swept away without a second thought. I had frozen the account and reversed the charges, but I knew that wasn't going to be the end of it. I had taken control of my finances, but the emotional damage still lingered. He had to know. He had to face what he'd done, and I needed him to feel the weight of it. But I wasn't prepared for what happened next. It was a Saturday morning when he called me. I had been dreading this moment, but when I saw his name flash across my phone screen, I hesitated before answering. My stomach dropped. He was probably trying to smooth things over, make excuses, or maybe even guilt-trip me into thinking I was overreacting. He was never one to take responsibility for his actions. "Hey, kid," his voice came through, a little too chipper for the situation. "I was hoping we could talk about something." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the wall in front of me. My heart was pounding. I could hear the faint sounds of traffic outside, the hum of the city. Everything felt distant and muted. "Sure. What's up?" I kept my tone neutral, not wanting to give anything away. "I've been thinking about this whole thing with the account," he said, his voice smooth, like he was trying to play it cool. "And I think there's been a misunderstanding. I didn't mean to upset you, but, well, you know how it is when you're in the moment. Karen and I, well, we were just having a good time, and I wasn't thinking about the money. I thought you'd be okay with it." I could feel the heat rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. His words were calculated, as though he was already trying to make me feel guilty, trying to convince me that it wasn't a big deal, that it wasn't his fault, but mine. A laugh bubbled up in my throat, though it wasn't a happy one. "You thought I'd be okay with it?" I repeated, my voice tight with barely restrained anger. "You thought it was fine to take everything I'd worked for without telling me and use it for your honeymoon? You thought that was okay?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear him shifting in his chair, trying to find the right words. "Listen, I'm sorry if you're upset, but you have to understand, it wasn't like that. You've got this account for emergencies, for your future, and I thought we were family. You've always said I could use the money for things like this. It's not like I took it for something frivolous." I bit my lips so hard I could taste blood. This was exactly what I had feared, his complete disregard for what I needed. His sense of entitlement had always been there, but now it was on full display. "Dad, you took my money, without asking, without telling me. And for what? A vacation? A honeymoon?" I nearly spat the word out. The audacity. "You didn't even think to tell me before you did it. I just found out by accident." There was a long silence, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. Finally, he spoke, but his tone had changed. It wasn't calm anymore. It was defensive, irritated. You're making a bigger deal out of this than it needs to be. It's just money, for crying out loud. I've always been there for you. I've always helped you, haven't I? The nerve. He really thought I owed him gratitude for helping me with things that were his responsibility in the first place? I gripped the edge of the table, so hard my knuckles turned white. You help me? You help me? With what? With your control? With guilt-tripping me into thinking I needed your approval for everything? I snapped, my voice rising. You opened that account to teach me how to save, Dad, how to plan for my future, and now you've drained it to fund your second honeymoon with Karen. He let out a sharp breath on the other end of the line. You think you're the only one who's worked hard? I've worked my whole life to give you what you needed. You don't appreciate that. I was done. Done with his manipulation. Done with his endless justifications. I don't need you to give me anything, Dad. I never asked for your approval, and I certainly never asked for you to take everything I've worked for. I froze the account. I reversed the charges, and that's what I should have done when I saw what you did. There was a strained silence on his end. I could hear the sound of him exhaling sharply, as though he was trying to contain his frustration. But I wasn't done. You don't get to treat me like a child anymore. I'm not the one who needs to apologize here. You do. For a moment, there was nothing but the quiet hum of the phone line. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, the adrenaline coursing through my veins. The confrontation had been inevitable, but it still left me shaken. Finally, he spoke again, and I could hear the shift in his voice, a mix of irritation and something darker, something I couldn't quite place. You've embarrassed me, you know that? What you've done, freezing the account like that, it's humiliating. I've never been so disrespected. I almost laughed, the sound bitter and hollow. You're embarrassed? Try being me for a second, Dad. Try realizing that your own father doesn't see you as a person, just a tool to fund his second honeymoon. He didn't have an answer to that. The silence between us was thick, heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. I hung up before he could say anything else. I knew that this conversation wasn't the end of it. He would be furious. He would try to guilt-trip me, spin it all into his favor, and blame me for everything. But I was done. He had taken too much from me already. This was my fight now, and I wasn't backing down. He had underestimated me, and now I was going to make sure he saw just how far I was willing to go. The next few days passed in a blur. Every time my phone buzzed or a text came through, my stomach would drop. I knew what it was. Dad trying to convince me to let him off the hook, trying to manipulate me back into his world where I was the one who always had to bend. But this time, I wasn't going to let him. I wasn't going to let him walk all over me anymore. It wasn't until Thursday afternoon that the final confrontation happened. I was sitting in my living room, scrolling through my emails, when I heard the unmistakable sound of a car pulling up outside. I looked out the window and saw Dad's truck parked in the driveway. He was here, and I knew what that meant. I'd been prepared for this moment. In my head, I'd rehearsed everything I'd say, every word that would make him understand that I wasn't backing down. But standing there, looking out at him as he walked up the front steps, I felt that familiar twist of doubt. Could I really do this? Could I really stand my ground and face him after everything? My phone buzzed again. A text from him. We need to talk. Open the door. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I just took a deep breath and walked toward the door. As I opened it, Dad stood there, wearing that familiar, too casual expression that always made me feel like I wasn't worth the effort. But today, it was different. Today, I was the one in control. He looked at me, his face a mixture of annoyance and something else, something I couldn't place. You froze the account, he said bluntly. No greeting, no small talk, just the accusation hanging in the air like a fog. I didn't flinch. Yes, I did, I replied coolly, folding my arms across my chest. I froze the account, and I reversed the charges. For a moment, there was silence between us. He studied me, trying to gauge whether I was bluffing, trying to find a crack in my resolve. He didn't find one. Look, he began, his voice shifting to that patronizing tone I knew so well. I get it. You're upset. But you need to understand, this isn't personal. Karen and I were just, well, we were just living our lives. It wasn't meant to hurt you. You took my money, Dad, I interrupted, my voice rising without thinking. It's personal because you took what was mine, without asking, without even telling me. You didn't care about my future, about the things I needed. All you cared about was getting what you wanted for yourself. His eyes flickered with something guilt, maybe, but it didn't last. I wasn't thinking straight, he muttered, his voice lowering. I was just trying to do something nice for Karen. She's been through a lot. I don't care about your excuses, I shot back. You didn't think about what I needed, what I had planned. You didn't even think to tell me that you were going to steal from me. His face hardened, and I could see the anger building up in him. I didn't steal anything, he said, his voice suddenly sharp. That account was always meant to be there for emergencies, and You opened it for me, Dad, I snapped, stepping closer to him now. You opened it to teach me how to save, how to be responsible with my own money. You didn't open it for you and Karen to use whenever you felt like it. This wasn't a family emergency. This was a luxury vacation, a honeymoon. His face turned red, the vein in his neck pulsing as he took a step toward me. You're making a scene, he growled, his voice thick with frustration. You're embarrassing me in front of your family, making it seem like I've done something terrible. You have no idea how hard this is for me. Oh, I have no idea? I repeated, my voice dangerously low. You've always made everything about you, Dad. You've always expected me to fall in line, to be grateful for whatever scraps you decide to throw my way. Well, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to let you walk all over me like I'm some kind of doormat. His eyes narrowed, and I saw a flash of something dark cross his face. You've really crossed the line this time, he said, his voice thick with anger. This is going to ruin everything. I don't care anymore, I said, my voice steady. I don't care if you're embarrassed. I don't care if this ruins your reputation. You took something from me that wasn't yours to take, and I'm not letting you get away with it. At that moment, something in him cracked. The anger shifted to a colder, more dangerous emotion frustration mixed with a sense of entitlement he had never tried to hide. You think you've won? He hissed, stepping closer to me. You think you've got all the control now, don't you? But you've made a mistake. You've embarrassed me, humiliated me in front of everyone, and I won't let you get away with this. I stood my ground, refusing to back down. The only mistake I made was trusting you. The only thing that's embarrassing is how far you'll go to keep pretending you're this perfect, loving father when you're just selfish. For a long moment, we stood there, the tension thick in the air. Then, something unexpected happened. He seemed to deflate, the anger slowly fading, leaving behind a man who, despite all his pride, couldn't find the words to argue anymore. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time I saw him as he really was. Weak, small, desperate. You've always been too smart for your own good, he muttered under his breath, his eyes averted. You never needed me. I agreed to meet him, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. He showed up at my apartment, standing at the door with that familiar, apologetic look on his face, the one he always wore when he wanted to smooth things over and pretend like everything was fine. But this time, I wasn't falling for it. Hey, kid, he said, his voice softer than it had been during our last conversation. I think we need to clear the air. I raised an eyebrow, not letting him see how much it hurt to hear him call me that again. Do we? He shifted uncomfortably on his feet, rubbing the back of his neck, looking anywhere but at me. For the first time, I could see that he wasn't the one in control. I was. I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe, waiting for him to continue. I'm sorry for how things went down, he said after a long pause. I was out of line. I shouldn't have taken your money without asking. It was thoughtless, and it wasn't fair to you. You didn't deserve that. It wasn't a full apology, not the one I'd hoped for, but it was enough. It wasn't about the words themselves, but about the fact that he had said them at all. It was the first time I'd seen him admit that he was wrong, and that was something I hadn't expected. It wasn't everything, but it was progress. I didn't say anything at first, just let the silence hang between us. Then, finally, I spoke. "You're right. It wasn't fair," I said quietly. "But it wasn't just about the money. It was about you not trusting me, about you using me when it was convenient for you. I thought I meant more to you than that. I thought I was your daughter, but I guess I was just a backup plan." He looked down at the ground, his eyes filled with regret. "I never meant to make you feel like that," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm sorry." I nodded, but I didn't feel any relief. I didn't feel like the weight of the situation had been completely lifted. There were things that couldn't be undone, things I would never be able to forget. But the conversation was important. It was the first time I'd ever seen him vulnerable, truly vulnerable. And I realized, finally, that it wasn't my job to fix him. "I can't go back to the way things were, Dad," I said softly. "I can't just forget what happened, but I'm not going to hold on to this anger forever either. I need to move on, for my own peace." He nodded, though I could tell it wasn't easy for him to accept. "I get that, and I understand if you need space. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I hope one day you can." I didn't answer him immediately. There was too much hurt still lingering between us, too much unresolved, but I didn't walk away angry either. I just walked away with the knowledge that, for once, I was standing in my own truth, and that felt powerful. The next few days were quieter. I didn't hear from him again, and I didn't try to reach out either. I knew this wasn't a quick fix. It was going to take time, maybe a lot of time, but I was okay with that. I began to make plans for myself, things I had put off for years. I looked at new apartments, explored job opportunities, and even signed up for a course I'd been meaning to take. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living in my father's shadow. I was living for myself. The money was a lesson, one I would never forget. But it wasn't the only thing that had been stolen from me. The trust I had placed in him, the idea that I owed him something for being my father, that was what I had really lost. And now that I knew my worth, I was finally free. I had taken control, and now I was moving forward.